Hello everyone, this is Miss Shannon coming to you from the Prescott Valley Public Library with the long-awaited ending to Chapter 4 of Mrs. Piggle Wiggle's Magic by Betty McDonald. If you recall, Chapter 4 is the bad table manners cure, in which Chris has awful table manners and his parents are very worried about it, and he gets invited to a dinner with very special people and his parents are just mortified. So Mrs. Piggle Wiggle sends over Lester, a very special pig, who helps them improve his table manners. Here we go. As a usual thing at breakfast, Chris dumped a pitcher of cream on his mush, put on 4 heaping spoons of sugar, then stirred and stirred as though he were mixing cement. When the mush was exactly the right consistency and the correct degree of coolness, he would lift the bowl up to just below his chin and shovel the mush in as fast as he could swallow. This morning, forgetting about Lester, he began his usual gluttonous proceedings, dumped the entire pitcher of cream on his mush, and was just reaching for the sugar when he looked up and saw Lester looking sadly into the empty cream pitcher. Instantly, he was sorry. He said, "Oh, gee, Lester, I didn't mean to be such a pig. I mean, such a glutton." Lester just looked at him. Chris said, "I'll get some more cream. Wait a minute." Lester shook his head. He reached over and picked up Chris's bowl of oatmeal and then carefully poured half the cream on his own cereal. Chris said, "That's right, we'll each have half. Would you like some sugar?" Lester nodded and helped himself carefully to 2 level spoons of sugar. Chris, who had watched him, did the same. When Chris started his cement mixer stirring, Lester reached over and took his spoon away and showed Chris how cereal should be eaten. A spoonful at a time, lifted slowly and daintily from the bowl so that each spoonful contained hot cereal, cold cream, and sweet sugar. Chris tried it. He said, "Say, Lester, this tastes much better than the old way." Lester nodded and smiled. When Chris began to scrape his dish, Lester shook his head and pointed to his spoon, placed on the plate beside his almost empty dish. When Chris was eating his scrambled eggs, Lester reached over and closed his mouth 3 times. He showed him that he must break his toast into small pieces and that he must not hold the toast in the palm of his hand while putting on jam. He made him put down his milk glass and wipe the milk mustache from his upper lip between sips. Chris obviously didn't mind these criticisms because he hugged Lester goodbye when he left for school and promised to run all the way home for lunch. It was a beautiful morning, and Mrs. Brown did a large washing. When she went to hang it on the line, Lester helped her carry the clothes basket of wet clothes from the basement, handed her clothespins as she needed them, and then, when the washing was all up, he laid down on the grass in the sun, well hidden from the neighbors by 2 sheets and a tablecloth. Mrs. Brown knelt down and timidly stroked his back. She said, "Thanks so much for helping with the clothes, Lester, and thank you so much for helping me with Chris's manners. I can see a great improvement already." Lester grunted a little. By the night of Dick Thompson's dinner party, Chris's table manners were absolutely perfect, and the Brown family all loved Lester so much that they couldn't even think about his ever leaving. Lester came upstairs with Chris while he bathed and got dressed. He washed Christopher's back and made him wash his ears twice. He made him polish his shoes and sent him back to his room for a clean handkerchief. After Chris had gone, Lester went out to the kitchen to wait for dinner. Noticing immediately that there was no place set for him on the kitchen table, and feeling lonely for Chris and quite sad, he started down to the basement to lie on his blanket. Mrs. Brown called to him. She said, "Lester, I thought that as long as Chris wasn't here, you would like to eat in the dining room with Mr. Brown and me." Lester nodded his head vigorously and trotted happily after her into the dining room. They had roast of lamb for dinner, and though Lester ate 3 large helpings, his table manners were so beautiful that Mr. and Mrs. Brown just stared at him in admiration. After dinner, Mr. Brown and Lester played catch while Mrs. Brown washed the dishes. Then they all sat in the living room and listened to the radio and waited for Christopher. He came home at 10 o'clock, bursting with excitement and filled with tales of Africa and lions. Everyone listened to his stories, heard what the Thompsons had to eat and what Uncle Charlie looked like, and then went to bed. The next morning, Mrs. Brown had 2 telephone calls. The first one made her very proud. It was from Mrs. Thompson, and she said that she just had to call Mrs. Brown and tell her that in all her life she had never seen such a beautifully behaved boy as Christopher. "His table manners are simply perfect," she said, and Mrs. Brown smiled and smiled. The second telephone call was from Mrs. Piggle, and it made Mrs. Brown very sad. Mrs. Piggle asked Mrs. Brown how she liked Lester, and Mrs. Brown said, "Oh, Mrs. Piggle, he has such perfectly beautiful manners. He is such a wonderful teacher, and he is so charming that I feel just like crying when I think of all the times I've said that people are pigs or ate like pigs or were selfish like pigs." Mrs. Piggle said, "Well, of course, all pigs aren't like Lester, but he is certainly a dear, and I hate to take him away from you so soon. But I have just had an emergency call from Mrs. Burbank. Tell Christopher to bring Lester over on his way back to school this noon." When Mrs. Brown said goodbye to Lester, she had tears in her eyes, and she thought he seemed a little sad at leaving. And that is the end of Chapter 4, The Bad Table Manners Cure, from Mrs. Piggle's Magic by Betty McDonald. And as always, our thanks to the publisher for letting us read the book online and waiving copyright law during this very trying time. All right, we'll see you next time.